Well, it's a great pleasure now to be talking to Eleanor Roberts, who's the archivist of the Halle Orchestra. And in that position, Eleanor, I would imagine that you come across the name of Michael Kennedy all the time.
Indeed, yes. I think it's probably fair to say that when I first arrived at the Halle, which was more years than I care to remember really now, back in 2002, he was casting a long shadow because he was effectively the kind of both unofficial and official historian of the orchestra. His book, The Halle Tradition, which was published to coincide with the centenary, is still my go-to Bible. It's my first point of reference. I read it very swiftly on my first arrival as being, the best way to discover about the history of the orchestra, which when I first arrived, I actually knew very, very little. And It's such a beautifully written book. I mean, that's one of Michael's great skills is his ability with language. And I think particularly in the world of classical music, which can seem so, kind of exclusive and intellectually superior. And one of the things that Michael was really, really good at was debunking a lot of that. And yet doing it in a way that still opened up, the kind of the beauty and the sort of sublime pleasure that you could get from music. So he never dumbed down, but he was just so articulate and so good at explaining things. And his approach to the Halle history is a really, really good one. He sort of breaks it down by looking at the music in a lot of detail throughout that first 100 years, but then also going behind the scenes, exploring what was happening, looking at the administration, the changing orchestra, all of that. It's just really beautifully done. I heartily recommend that book if you can get hold of it and haven't read it and you're interested in that first 100 years of one of Britain's oldest orchestras. It's still the best thing out there, really.
Yeah.
So yes, he did indeed. I came across him very swiftly, and I was quite nervous actually, because within a few years of my being there, we celebrated the 150th anniversary of the orchestra. So there was quite a lot of scrutiny in terms of the kind of later period, that additional 50 years. And of course, we did all the things like putting together an exhibition, producing a souvenir program for the 150th concert. And I created quite a lot of that content. And I was nervous of setting myself up,
Yes.
sort of as the successor, if you like. And he was so kind. And particularly, I remember very vividly both him and Joyce at the 150th concert. He was holding the programme, and one of the things I'd done was a tiny little paragraph about each of our principal conductors. Not that many, in fact, in 150 years,
Yeah.
but not easy to try and encapsulate, just in a few words, each one of them. And that's what I'd done. And he pointed to it and he said, "Did you write this?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Well, it's really very good. And you're not credited." And I said, "Well, no, that's because I work for the Halle."
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
said, "Well, you should be."
Yeah. Well, look, you bring in the question there of that special program for that
Mm,
anniversary concert, and of course, it's one thing people being able to access the Halle tradition, get off a library shelf, what have you, but then there must have been hundreds of program notes for Halle
absolutely.
concerts. Tell
Yes,
me something about those.
absolutely.
Well, presumably they were typified in the same way you've described his writing in the book.
Yes, they were. We do still use them. There are some works in particular where, he just kind of hasn't been equaled in terms of explaining what's going on with the music. I'm a huge fan of program notes. I know that they can seem perhaps a little bit old-fashioned now, and there is a bit of a move away from printed programs full stop for all the obvious reasons. But actually, when you're listening to something for the first time, I find sitting and looking at a few paragraphs of writing that's headed "the music" and takes you through step by step, trying to elucidate what's happening. But particularly what I loved about Michael was that he would very often say, "And at this point, listen out for," and you'd hear it. And that was a real sort of sense of connection with the music, of sort of thinking, right, yes, I see exactly what he means. The horns do have a real whatever it is at that point.
And I guess one of the points here is that he wasn't an academic musicologist. He was a musical enthusiast.
Yes.
That was the point. So he understood what it meant to be sitting there listening to a work for the first time.
Indeed. And I think he did. And I don't think he ever lost that ability, or, as you say, that enthusiasm, which is infectious. And one of my other memories of him, again around that sort of time, was at a post-concert reception for sort of supporters and members of the audience, and it was still relatively early on in Mark Elder's tenure at the Halle, but Michael was amongst those critics who was starting to say something really exciting is happening here. And I think he did coin the phrase kind of "the great days are here again," or something along those lines. And he spoke at this reception by way of introduction to Mark. And one of the things he said was that the Halle has always been at its height when one person has really identified with it, as the conductor has kind of embodied it, embraced it, and really wanted the orchestra to succeed. And he said that's happened 3 times in my experience. So the first, of course, was Charles Halle. It was very much his creation. But then we had Sir John Barbarolli, and now we have Mark Elder. And he very early on kind of set Mark against those 2 pillars, if you like. And of course, in so many ways that was borne out in later years with the length of Mark's tenure and with all of his other achievements, and particularly in the kind of English music embracing, which I understood from Mark only when he left, really. I assumed that their friendship went way, way back, but of course it didn't. They met when Mark came up to the Halle. And he would tell this story much better than me, but I think fairly early on, he was sort of buttonholed by Michael, who said, "You need to, embrace Elgar and Vaughan Williams and English music. That's what the Halle is all about. That's the tradition." And of course, he did.
Well, because we haven't mentioned the words Vaughan Williams until you uttered there, and of course, when you mention Barbarolli and Mark Elder, I mean that in that triangle with Michael, that's a Vaughan Williams triangle.
Yes.
And I don't know how often you come across in the archive references to Vaughan Williams, the sort of thing that's there. I mean, I don't know. What is there?
Well, quite a lot, particularly from the Barbarolli era, of course, because there was that friendship between them, with the Glorious John reference, of course. So alongside the many sort of programmes, we've got wonderful sets of photographs, because Vaughan Williams did come and listen to the orchestra playing his music, which not all composers do, and so there are some lovely photographs. I quite recently, somebody was talking about the fact that you hardly ever saw Vaughan Williams smiling in photographs. I think we do have 1 or 2 where just a little bit of maybe a little bit of crinkling around the eyes. But and we also have a couple of the scores. That my particular favourite is the one for Sinfonia Antarctica, which of course we did the premiere of, and the score for that, on the first day of rehearsals, someone, I don't know if it was JB or who suggested it, but everybody signed it. So the full orchestra signed it, the ladies who were singing from the choir signed it, and of course JB and Vaughan Williams signed it as well. So on the sort of the front and end papers, we've got all these wonderful signatures, and it just captures that moment in time on a cold November day, I think it was, when they started rehearsing.
I just love that. I've got to see it. I've got to come up to Manchester.
Okay.
So, I mean, do many people come and access the archives? I mean, specifically to learn more about Vaughan Williams. Is it used?
It is. I mean, sadly, although I can talk a little bit about this if I'm allowed to, but we don't have much physical space. So in terms of actually, sort of opening up to lots of people, it's really difficult. So people do need to get in touch with us if they want to come and have a look. And then we do our level best to make it possible. However, in the last few years, we've been doing a project with the archive funded by the National Heritage Lottery Fund. And an end aim and ambition of that is to have a sort of fully fledged service, if you like, with a proper reading room and proper facilities so that people can come and see, because it is a wonderful archive. We do have so much material about, music in general, but British music in particular, because of that identification that the Hallés long had with sort of championing homegrown composers, if you like. We were a little bit late with Vaughan Williams, it is fair to say. Took us a while. I think it was during the First World War, when Sir Thomas Beecham was sort of at the helm, that we really sort of discovered him as a composer. So it did take us a while, but then, as I say, in his later years in particular, it was quite a close bond, and there's not many significant Hallé occasions that don't feature Vaughan Williams. It's a fairly sort of regular, we've got a celebration of some kind coming up, oh well, there needs to be a piece of Vaughan Williams in there. It's music that I certainly feel I've got to know in the last 20 years or so of my time here, other than the Lark Ascending, which I knew before I first arrived. Of course, lots of people do. I didn't know very much about the symphonies in particular, and they all feel a lot more familiar. The London Symphony, of course, was one of Barbarolli's favourites because he loved London, and he felt it just captured and sort of celebrated it at its best.
Yeah. Of course, we've basically spoken about Michael the writer, but we shouldn't forget. I mean, the listeners to Radio 3 will know him as a brilliant communicator in vocal terms, and presumably, well, I know that he did loads of pre-concert talks at the Hallé. In fact, I must just put in here a memory of doing one with him on the Vaughan Williams Pastoral Symphony, and I just visited the area where Vaughan Williams served in the Great War at Equivre, and I had lots of photographs and things, and I thought I would be in charge of this sort of discussion on the platform, and I would feed in these photographs. So I phoned up Michael and said, well, look, I think these are the sort of 6, 7 or 8 questions I'm going to ask you in the course of this discussion. So I introduced us to the audience who came along, this pre-concert talk, and I asked the first question. 7 or 8 minutes later, Michael was still talking, and he had covered all the subjects in all the questions that I'd asked him, and we hadn't looked at a single photograph. I mean, look, there was a challenge for the interviewer. Well, I was supposed to be just discussing it with him.
Yeah.
The sort of backtrack. But it nonetheless encapsulated just how fluent a verbal communicator he was.
Yes, and actually much missed as a contributor to those talks, which are still a regular feature, because yeah, he, as you say, he just had that facility to make something understandable that might otherwise seem to be very, very difficult. And what I think is so important is that there was just that element of trust, I think, with him, so that you would feel, if he thinks that this is a good piece of music or that this is worth listening to, then even though my first instinct might be, ooh, I should give it a go because Michael says that it's good, and those sorts of relationships are so important in the world of the arts, aren't they? Because otherwise you could very quickly become, just stay in your comfort zone, never listen to anything that's challenging. And I think developing that willingness to think the first time, I'm not sure what I made of that, but I'll listen to it again, and accepting that that's okay, that not everybody does like something the first time you hear it. It may take two or three listenings, and then suddenly you think, I get what this is about now. And that, again, coming back to the program notes, that's where they help, I think, because unless perhaps you do just want to sit and just listen. But for me, I like that slightly unpicking of what is this about? Because if you can get into perhaps the storytelling or the context, then things can seem a little clearer.
Well, I just recently went to a number of concerts in a particular concert series. I won't say where or what it was about, but there was not a single program note for any of the concerts, and I felt completely lost. It's not a historic thing. Well, look, Eleanor, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. We could go on for absolutely ever. Thank you very much indeed. I hope that this will mean that more people come up to consult the archive if they can find a space to actually look at the stuff.
Indeed. Yes. We can be contacted via the website. So please, anyone out there, feel free.
Eleanor, thanks very much indeed. Eleanor Roberts at the Halle. Well, let me introduce you now to Jessica Smith, who's the Creative Arts Archivist at the John Rylands Library in Manchester. And you look after, amongst much else, Jessica, the Michael Kennedy Archive. And big question to start off with, how important is it? And if so, if it is important, what's it largely important for?
I think it's a very important archive in the field of classical music criticism. And also we are very grateful to have it in Manchester because, of course, Michael Kennedy is a Manchester writer. So I think it sits in the perfect location, but it's also incredibly important if you're looking at things like the creative process and the way the research is done for putting together a musical biography, for example, or all of the incredible work that Michael Kennedy did in journalism and in criticism and review. It's got a wonderful series of correspondence relating to that research and also to a lot of the people he spoke to and befriended, of course, like Vaughan Williams. And the lion's share of the correspondence is actually about his biography of Vaughan Williams. So it's an incredibly apposite thing to be talking to you about.
Yeah, so that there'll be a host of famous names amongst the people that he wrote to them saying, maybe with specific questions or perhaps with general impressions of Vaughan Williams, a whole range of stuff, presumably.
Absolutely. And the correspondence is fascinating because you can see how granular he was. He talks to people about very specific performances and very specific pieces and it's incredibly holistic, his approach. He's very interested in all of that detail. And of course, then writes to Vaughan Williams and incredibly gets a response, and they become friends. And then, of course, he becomes, he's chosen as the biographer. So, but we've also got names like Elgar in there, of course, and Britten and Strauss and Mahler. So there's a whole, and Bertrand Russell. And there's actually a great series of correspondence from Elgar's daughter. And that's Carice Elgar Blake. Yeah, when they're talking about the Elgar biography that Kennedy wrote. So it's a who's who really for the 20th century.
It's fascinating because it does give us an insight into Michael's mind. All this effort that goes into writing these books. And some people might say, well, I'm going to get rid of all this stuff now I've finished the book. But no, it's in a sense, there's an archivist in Michael's brain that says, no, this should be kept.
That's absolutely right. And what's really interesting is he actually deposits the collection in 1975. So he's thinking about this a long time before the end of his career. And to an extent, sort of like personally curating it and deciding what's important and what isn't and what to select, and that the manuscripts are important and the correspondence and so he's actually incredibly forward thinking in that way to have been able to provide us with these incredible manuscripts. Because I mean, the beauty of particularly the Vaughan Williams manuscript is that it's so different to the published version. So we get to see where he started and where he ended up. And that's absolutely fascinating, to see the notes and the crossings out, and just sort of wonder why some of it happened.
Yeah. So I'm not quite sure if you hinted at it a moment ago, but did it arrive, as far as you know, in quite a neat form? Was he a neat and tidy, orderly person?
I think I'm going to be completely honest. I think a little bit of that he was certainly neat, but I think Dr. Joyce Kennedy, his partner, had a sort of a certain degree of assistance in the administrative side of collating everything into the right places. So I was very fortunate. I got to visit her again in 2019. And she still had a very neat and orderly roll of folders that told you exactly which project the paperwork related to and where the files were, and kind of, so I think collectively they were a very good team, which was incredibly beneficial for us, of course, because it saved us an awful lot of time.
Yeah, wonderful that you were able to meet Joyce, and as I understand it, there's a whole new tranche of material that she was able to donate to you.
Yes, that's right. It was a sort of 2018, 2019, and I think a lot of the process of archiving somebody's personal papers can be just that. It can be very personal. So sometimes you have to wait until somebody is ready for that process to take place, in every sense. But then, of course, we got some wonderful new material, all about, the books on Strauss and Britten and Bolt, Adrian Bolt, and a lot of his later articles. So she was really instrumental in making sure that we had a full picture of Kennedy's work in that way.
Okay. Immediate rush of people to actually use the archive is not necessary. This is the long term that one's looking for. But even so, I have to ask, is it being used a lot?
It is being used. So it is fully catalogued, and that catalogue is available online. So it's accessible in our reading room for anybody who would like to see it. They just have to book an appointment. I'm going to say it's probably not one of the better used of my remit, if I'm honest. So there is certainly, I can see, but it's when you set it up against things like the Elizabeth Gaskell papers or the Charles Dickens manuscripts, then obviously we have a different degree of interest in those from a much wider, range of researchers. So I'm going to say it certainly does get use. It's not unused, but it's not as much as I'd like.
Well, hopefully a few people will be encouraged to actually access it now. I mean, I wonder how many people that are accessing it from abroad, one way or the other.
I think it's mostly been in person up to this point, but we do offer virtual appointments sort of via Zoom. So you can just sort of book an hour with one of our reading room staff, and they'll literally turn the pages for you, as it were, over Zoom, so that you can take pictures of things.
But there's not you suddenly appeared in the library from Australia or from Chile or somewhere. Has that actually happened, I wonder?
Not to my knowledge, I'm afraid. Yeah. I would love it if it did. Yeah, I hope they'll let me know they're coming.
Well, I guarantee that there's somebody in Chile who has Vaughan Williams as a favourite composer. That's definitely going to be the case. But look, to re-emphasise what you've just said, anybody can access this archive. They just have to get in touch, and one way or another, you will help them to access the Michael Kennedy archive.
Absolutely. Yes, of course. Yeah, we're a research library, but we're also a public library. So we've always been a public free library, and we think that's really important.
Well, on behalf of everybody in the Vaughan Williams Society, Jessica, thank you so much for all that you and your colleagues are doing to make sure that the name of the great Michael Kennedy lives on. And I do mean the great Michael Kennedy. Thank you for your time today. Thanks, Jess.
Thank you very much for having me.